At some point, the tools that helped your business get started can become the things slowing it down. The Wi Fi still works, the computers still turn on, the software still opens. But everything takes a little more effort than it should. Files are harder to find. Communication gets messier. Workarounds become normal. And slowly, the business starts spending more energy fighting its systems than using them. So, if your business feels harder to operate than it used to, stick around because the problem may not be your people. It may not be your growth. It may be that your business has outgrown the IT setup holding it together. Let's start it up. Hello, and welcome to Stack and Startup Al Fresco. And today, I want to talk to you about something that happens to a lot of businesses quietly. They grow. Not explosive startup growth, not overnight success, not some dramatic hockey stick chart, just normal business growth. More employees, more clients, more operational complexity. And eventually, the systems that once worked perfectly fine start struggling under the weight of the business. One of the realities of business growth is this: complexity shows up faster than people expect. Not always dramatically, not all at once, and usually not in a way that feels like a crisis. Most of the time, it shows up quietly. A few more employees, a few more tools, a few more things the business has to keep track of. And at first, that seems manageable because the old setup still works. The same router is still online, the same software still runs. So nobody feels an urgent need to change anything. The business says, "This has gotten us this far. Why mess with it now?" And that's understandable. A small business does not usually start with a complex IT environment. It starts with what it needs at the time: a few computers, a basic network, a shared folder that made perfect sense when three people were using it. That setup may have been exactly right for that stage of the business. The problem is not that the original setup was bad. The problem is the business changed. More people means more access. More customers means more data. More activity means more dependency on the systems underneath everything. And every one of those changes adds weight. Not just technical weight, operational weight. When a business is small enough, people can compensate with memory. They can lean over and ask a question. They can keep things informal. But as the business grows, informal systems start to crack. The folder that used to be simple becomes confusing. The software that used to be enough starts creating bottlenecks. The network that used to support everyone starts struggling under more devices, more traffic, and more expectations. And again, nothing may be technically broken. That's what makes it easy to miss. The business is still operating, people are still working, customers are still being served. But everything takes a little more effort than it used to. That is often the first sign that the business has outgrown its setup. Not a dramatic failure, not a total shutdown, just friction. A little more waiting, a little more confusion, a little more dependence on workarounds. And if the business does not notice that friction early, it starts to become normal. People adjust. They create shortcuts. They avoid the systems that annoy them. That is where growth gets dangerous because the business may think it is becoming more mature, but underneath the surface, it may just be stacking more complexity on top of systems built for a smaller version of your company. This is not why it still works is not enough. A system can still work and it can still be too small for the business. These two things can still be true. A process can still function and still be slowing people down. A technology setup can still be online and still be holding the company back. That distinction matters because when a business outgrows its IT setup, the issue is not always failure. Sometimes the issue is fit. The tools fit the old business. The workflows fit the old team. The infrastructure fit the old levels of complexity. But the business has moved on, and the setup didn't. That mismatch is where operational drag begins. When that happens, the business may start blaming the wrong thing. It may blame the employees. It may blame the workload. It may blame the growth itself, if you can believe that. But sometimes the real issue is simpler than that. The business grew, and the systems stayed behind. That is the first signal to look for. Not whether everything has failed, but whether the business is starting to feel heavier than it should. Because when the tools that used to help you move forward start slowing you down, that is usually a sign the business has reached a new stage and the setup needs to catch up. So, what does it look like when a business has outgrown its IT? Most of the time, it does not show up as one big obvious failure. It shows up as patterns. And there are three patterns I would pay attention to. The first warning sign is recurring friction. Not one bad day, not one slow login, not one weird computer issue that happens once and never comes back. I mean the same problems showing up again and again and again. Systems are slow every morning. Files take too long to open. Remote access works, but only when it feels like it. At first, people treat those things like small annoyances. They sigh, they wait, they restart something, they try again. But repeated friction is not just annoying. Repeated friction is information. It is your business telling you something underneath the surface is not keeping up anymore. And the problem with reoccurring friction is that people eventually build their workday around it. They start logging in earlier because they know the system takes forever. They avoid certain tools because they do not trust them. They create a side process because the official process is just too painful. That is when technology stops being support and it starts to become a drag. The second warning sign is workaround culture. Every business has a few workarounds. That is normal. But when workarounds become the main way of doing things, that is a problem. You hear phrases like, you have to do it this way, or the system only works if you do this first, or just ask Lisa, she knows where everything is. That kind of language tells you something. It means the official process is not enough. It means the system is not clear enough. It means the business is depending on tribal knowledge instead of reliable infrastructure. And again, that may work for a while, especially if you have good people. Good people can cover up a lot of bad systems. They remember the steps, they know the expectations, and they know which button not to click. But that doesn't mean the business is healthy. It means the business is leaning too hard on memory. And memory does not scale. Because what happens when that person is out sick? What happens when they go on vacation? What happens when they leave? Suddenly, the business discovers that the process was not really documented. It was living in somebody's head. That is not a technology problem by itself. That is an operational risk. The third warning sign is loss of trust. And this one matters because once employees stop trusting the system, they start building around them. They double check everything manually. They keep their own copies of files. They avoid using the official tool because they assume it's wrong, slow, or incomplete. That is a major signal because when people stop trusting the system, the business no longer has one process, it has a bunch of unofficial processes. One person tracks things in a spreadsheet, another person saves file onto their desktop. Another person keeps notes in email because they do not trust the shared system. Now, the business has more than an IT issue. It has a visibility issue. Leadership may think there is one workflow, but the team may actually be running 3 different versions of the same process. That is how mistakes happen. That is how communication breaks down. That is how customer experience starts getting inconsistent. And the frustrating part is, none of this means the business is failing. It may be growing. It may be busy. It may be serving more customers than ever before. But that is exactly why these warning signs matter. Because growth puts pressure on the systems underneath the business. And if those systems were built for a smaller version of the company, they will eventually start showing strain. So, if you want to know whether your business has outgrown its IT setup, don't look only to the major failures. Look for recurring friction. Look for workaround culture. Look for a lack of trust. Those are the early signals. They tell you the business may still be moving forward, but the systems underneath it are no longer helping as much as they should. And once that happens, technology is no longer just a tool. It becomes part of the operational weight the business has to carry. One thing businesses sometimes miss is that IT problems rarely stay IT problems. They spread. Not because technology is magic, not because every business problem is secretly a tech problem, but because technology is connected to almost everything a modern business does. It's how people communicate, it's how people find information, it's how people serve your customers. So when the systems underneath the business start struggling, the efforts do not stay neatly tucked away in the server room, assuming there even is a server room. They show up everywhere. A slow system becomes a productivity problem. A confusing file structure becomes a communication problem. An unreliable process becomes a customer experience problem. That is the part that matters because the business may think it is dealing with small technical annoyances, but the team may be feeling something much bigger. They're losing time. They are repeating work. They are making decisions with incomplete information. And eventually, leadership starts wondering why the business feels harder to run than it used to. That is the dangerous part. Because when a business grows, some amount of complexity is normal. More people means more coordination. More customers means more expectations. More activity means more moving parts. That is not failure, that is growth. But if the systems do not grow with the business, normal complexity turns into unnecessary friction. And unnecessary friction wears people down. It makes simple tasks feel heavier. It makes communication less clear. It makes good employees spend too much time fighting the tools they are supposed to use. That is when businesses start blaming the wrong thing. They think the team is disorganized. They think the workload is the problem. They think growth itself is creating chaos. And sometimes, yes, there may be staffing problems. There may be process problems. There may be leadership problems. But sometimes the issue is simpler. The business is asking old systems to support a new level of complexity. That mismatch creates drag. And drag is expensive, even when it doesn't look like an invoice. It costs time, it costs focus, it costs trust. If employees do not trust the system, they double check everything. If customers do not get consistent answers, they lose confidence. If leadership cannot see what is happening, decisions get slower and less accurate. That is why infrastructure matters. Not because technology is the point of the business. For most businesses, it isn't. The point is serving customers, delivering value, and doing the work. But infrastructure is what allows the work to happen cleanly. It is the foundation underneath the operation. And when the foundation starts shifting, everything built on top of it starts feeling unstable. This is why I do not like treating IT as a separate little box. Like it is just computers or Wi Fi or printers or whatever device made everyone angry this week. Those things matter, but the bigger issue is operational support. Does the setup help people do their jobs? Does it make information easier to find? Does it make the business easier to manage? Or does it quietly add friction to everything? That is the real question, because when a business outgrows its IT setup, the problem is not just the technology is old. The problem is the business has become more complex and the support structure underneath it has not kept up. That is why these problems can feel so confusing. On paper, the business may be doing better, more customers, more work, more opportunity. But inside the operation, it feels harder to coordinate, harder to track things, harder to keep everyone on the same page. And that is usually the sign that something underneath the business needs attention. Again, not because everything is broken, not because growth is bad, not because the team failed, but because the business reached a new stage and the systems need to match that stage. So, if your business feels more complicated than it should, don't just ask, what is wrong with the team? Ask, what are we asking the team to work through every day? Because sometimes the people are not the problem. Sometimes the process is not even the whole problem. Sometimes the business is just running a larger operation on systems that were built for a smaller one. And once you see it that way, the conversation changes. It is no longer just an IT issue. It is an operational maturity issue. And that is the conversation growing businesses need to have. So, if the warning signs are there, why do businesses wait so long to deal with them? Usually, it comes down to three things. The business is still functioning, there are other priorities, and infrastructure spending is hard to justify before something breaks. Let's start with the first one. The business is still functioning. People are still working, customers are still being served, revenue is still coming in. So, from the outside, it can look like there is no real problem. The systems may be annoying, but they're not completely broken. The process may be clunky, but work is still getting done. The technology may be outdated, but the business has learned how to live with it. That's what makes it very easy to say, we can wait. And sometimes waiting is a valid business decision. Not everything needs to be fixed immediately. Not every old system needs to be replaced. Not every inconvenience deserves a major project. But there's a difference between waiting strategically and waiting because no one wants to look too closely. The second reason businesses wait is there are always other priorities. Payroll matters, sales matter, customer issues matter. And when the business is busy, infrastructure can feel like one more thing competing for attention. It is easy to push it down the list. We will deal with that next quarter, or we will look at it after the busy season, or we will fix it once things slow down. But here's the problem. For a growing business, things may not slow down. The business may just keep adding more people, more customers, and more complexity. So the issue that was supposed to be handled later keeps getting pushed into a business that is becoming harder to support. That is how small problems get room to grow. The third reason businesses wait is that infrastructure spending is hard to justify before something breaks. And I understand that. It's not always exciting, it's not always visible, it does not always feel like growth. A better network does not usually get a round of applause. A cleaner file structure does not feel as urgent as a new customer. A proper backup plan is easy to ignore right up until the day you need it. That is why infrastructure can be a hard sell. When it works, people barely notice it. When it fails, it becomes the only thing anyone can think about it. That is the frustrating part. Good infrastructure often feels invisible, but bad infrastructure becomes very visible very quickly. And by then, the business is no longer making a calm decision, it is making a pressured decision. Something failed, someone is frustrated, customers may be affected. The team needs answers now. That is when costs go up. Not just financial costs, operational costs, stress costs, and trust costs. Because reactive changes usually happen under pressure, and businesses rarely make their best decisions under pressure. That's why waiting too long is so expensive. Not because every delayed upgrade becomes a disaster, not because every old system is dangerous, not because businesses should spend money just to avoid feeling nervous. It is expensive because the longer a business waits, the fewer clean options it usually has. The schedule gets tighter, workarounds become more embedded, the risk becomes harder to separate from normal operations. And eventually, the business does not get to choose the best time to make a change. The problem chooses the time. That is the real danger. When a business waits too long, it gives up control. It gives up the chance to plan. It gives up the ability to change on its own terms. So the better question is not, can we wait? Sometimes the answer is yes. The better question is, what happens if waiting stops being our choice? Because if the business has a plan, waiting can be strategy. But if there is no plan, no owner, and no timeline, then waiting is not a strategy. It's just hoping nothing breaks down before you get around to it. And hope is not infrastructure. So if a business thinks it may have outgrown its IT setup, what should it actually evaluate? Because the answer is not buy everything new. That is not strategy. That is panic with a purchase order. A business does not need the newest technology just because it is growing. It doesn't need enterprise tools just because it added a few people. It does not need to replace every system just because something feels annoying. But it does need to ask better questions. And I would start with these three. First, are the systems helping people move faster or forcing them to work harder? That is the basic test. Technology should reduce friction. It should make information easier to find. It should make communication easier to manage. It should make the work easier to complete. Not perfect, not magical, just better. But if employees are constantly waiting, constantly double checking, constantly creating side processes, then the system may not be supporting the work anymore. It may be adding weight to it. And that matters because a system does not have to completely fail to slow the business down. Sometimes the damage is smaller than that. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, a little confusion, a little duplicated work. That may not look traumatic in one moment, but across a team, over weeks and months, that becomes real operational costs. The second question is, can this setup scale cleanly if the business keeps growing? That doesn't mean can this survive one more person. It means can this support the next stage of the business? More employees, more customers, more files. If the answer is no, then the business needs to know that before growth makes the problem bigger. Because growth does not usually reduce complexity. Growth adds pressure. And if the foundation is already strained, the more pressure does not make it stronger. It exposes the weakness. That is why businesses should look at their systems before they are overwhelmed. Not because everything needs to change immediately, but because leadership needs to know what will break first. The third question is, if something major failed tomorrow, would recovery be organized or chaotic? That question tells you a lot. If the internet went down, who handles it? If the main computer failed, where is the data? If the person who knows the process is unavailable, can anyone else keep things moving? Those are not scare questions. Those are business continuity questions because every business has problems. Every business has bad days. Every business has something that eventually breaks. The question is not whether something will go wrong. The question is whether the business has enough structure to respond without complete chaos. This is where operational maturity shows up. Not in having the flashiest tools, not in having the most expensive software, not in chasing every new platform that promises to solve everything. Operational maturity shows up in the boring places. Clear ownership, reliable systems, documented processes. Those things, they're not exciting, but they are what keep a business from depending on luck. So if you want to evaluate whether a business has outgrown its IT setup, start there. Are your systems helping people move faster or forcing them to work harder? Can your setup scale cleanly? Or is growth adding pressure to something already strained? And if something major failed tomorrow, would recovery be organized or chaotic? Those three questions will tell you more than a shiny product demo ever will. Because the goal is not to have the newest setup The goal is to have the right setup for your business you are actually running, not the business you were 3 years ago, not the business you were when there were only a few people, not the business you were before the work became more complicated. The business you are running now. That is the real evaluation. Does the setup match the current business? Does it support the next stage? Does it reduce friction instead of creating it? If the answer is yes, great. Keep maintaining it, keep documenting it, keep paying attention. Because if the answer is no, then the business should not wait for failure to prove the point. Because by the time everything breaks, you're not evaluating anymore. You are reacting. And reacting is almost always more expensive than planning. So do the evaluation while the business still has choices. Look at the systems. Look at the friction. Look at the places where people are quietly compensating every day. That is where the answer usually is. Because outgrowing your IT setup does not always look like a disaster. Sometimes it looks like a business that has to work harder than it should to do things that should be easier. So far, I have not been able to see firsthand the growth that I've talked about in this video. Most of what I've seen has come after the fact, though I have seen several spreadsheets turn into massive checklists that, if you actually ran them, nothing would get done. I've also seen other shifts have massive growth while a less important one gets completely ignored. In all the cases that I have seen it took leadership and workers weeks or months to get things right, if they even were able to at all. I was on a major project once in my career. However, for 2 years, I didn't feel like it was much of a major project because I was on the night shift and very little communication would flow our way. So, the very few times something would come up for me to handle, it was treated like, you know what? We'll just handle it on the day shift. I come in the next shift and ask how it was handled. The mid shift would say, oh, day shift handled it. Okay, cool. Back to day shift, and because they haven't had their coffee yet, it wasn't important to explain a solved issue. Our team grew, but communication didn't. And it hurt and created perceptions that were just not true. So, outgrowing your IT setup is not always a bad sign. In a lot of cases, it means the business grew, the team expanded, the operations reached a new stage. That is not failure, that is progress. The problem is when the business keeps moving forward, but the systems underneath stay frozen. A setup that worked for 3 people may not work for 15. A process that worked for a few customers may not work when the schedule is full. A habit that worked when things were informal may not hold up when the stakes get higher. That is where friction starts. Not because the business is broken, but because the business changed and the infrastructure didn't change with it. So the goal is not to chase the newest technology. The goal is to make sure the systems support the business you are actually running now. Not the business you started with, not the business you remember, the business you are running now. So if your business feels harder to operate than it used to, pay attention to that. It may not be your people. It may not be the growth itself. It may be that the systems that helped you get here are not the systems that will help you move forward. Outgrowing your IT setup doesn't always look like a disaster. Sometimes it looks like slower work, more workarounds, and a business that has to fight too hard to do things that should be easier. So ask the question before a crisis asks it for you. Has the business outgrown the setup? If the answer is yes, that is not a failure. That is a signal. So thank you for tuning in to Stack and Startup Al Fresco. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss future conversations around business, technology, and growth. You can also find us anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you want to directly support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/stackandstartup. Until next time, keep thinking outside the box.